Hi, and welcome everyone to Arts Across America. This is a segment that we're so excited to be having, and this is presented by Sankofa.org and the Kennedy Center. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the ancestors, all those who came before us, who paved a way for us to be here today. I would like to acknowledge our Native and Indigenous brothers and sisters and our African ancestors, all our relations who assisted in providing us space and paved way to be here, gathered today, right here, right now. My name is Gina Belafonte. I am an artivist and the executive director of Sankofa.org. Sankofa is a nonprofit organization founded by my father, along with myself and Raul Roach. We educate, motivate, and activate artists and allies in service of grassroots movements and equitable change. We use the arts as a tool to engage the public. The Kennedy Center is working with us to create and curate performances from geodiverse locations across the country to uplift and tell the story of their communities in the time of coronavirus. Arts Across America utilizes the Kennedy Center's digital platforms and partnerships with community organizations to connect and uplift stories and art of communities from across the country, while also providing much needed support to artists. Arts Across America performances feature visionary cultural curators, artists, workers, using their power and agency to transform their community and thus the world. This is as much a celebration of the community that surrounds the artist as it is about the art itself. Today we have what I refer to as an epic, very special segment, discussing the art of organizing, then and now. Sankofa is honored to partner with the Kennedy Center. And I would like to, at this time, introduce my co-moderator for today's segment, Thandiwe Abdullah. Thandiwe Abdullah is a 16-year-old organizer with Black Lives Matter. She helped to conceptualize and launch the Black Lives Matter in Schools campaign, adopted by the National Education Association. Her work is to create safe spaces for Black youth to organize around racism and anti-Blackness, particularly in schools. Welcome, Thandiwe.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Miss Gina. I'm very excited for this panel that we're about to have.
Yes, I am too. And because it's so epic and there's such amazing participants, let's dive right in. Please, why don't you welcome in our first three panelists?
Okay, so our first panelist is the amazing Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta, president and founder of the Dolores Huerta Foundation and co-founder of the United Farm Workers of America. She is a labor leader and community organizer. She has worked civil rights and social justice for over the past 50 years. In 1962, she and Cesar Chavez founded the United Farm Workers Union. She served as vice president and played a critical role in many of the union's accomplishments for 4 decades. In 2002, she received the Puffin Nation $100,000 prize for creative citizenship, which she used to establish the Dolores Huerta Foundation, DHF. DHF is connecting groundbreaking community-based organizing to state and national movements to register and educate voters, advocate for education reform, bring about infrastructure improvements in low-income communities, advocate for greater equality for the LGBTQ community, and create strong leadership development. Our next panelist is Reverend James Lawson. The Reverend James M. Lawson Jr. began resisting racism as a young child in Massillon, Ohio. By high school, he had become a firm opponent of anti-Semitism and of religious bigotry in every form and decided to become a follower of Jesus. He was determined to disobey racist laws and resist the culture of racism. In college, he became a political prisoner because he violated the Selective Service Act of 1948, requiring military service, which he found to be an unjust law. In 1947, he began to read the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and embraced Gandhi's teachings of Satyagraha, translated as Soul Force or Nonviolent Resistance. At the urging of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Lawson moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and joined the emerging nonviolent direct action movements initiated by Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and others. According to Representative John Lewis, Reverend Lawson was the architect of the nonviolent civil rights movement. And for many decades, he has worked as a United Methodist pastor of congregations in Ohio, Tennessee, and Los Angeles. Reverend James M. Lawson Jr. and Dorothy Lawson have been companions for 61 years, and they have 3 sons and 3 grandchildren.
Before we move on to our next panelist, let me just let everyone know that Reverend James Lawson is having some technical difficulties in joining us, and we're hopeful that he'll come in at some point during the process of this very interesting conversation. But I just wanted to let everyone know that's why he is not on our screen with us quite yet. All right, thank you. Sorry, Cindy Ray.
No problem. Thanks for letting everyone know. Our next panelist is Angela Davis. Through her activism and scholarship over many decades, Dr. Angela Davis has been deeply involved in movements for social justice around the world. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. She draws upon her own experience in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Having helped popularize the notion of a prison industrial complex, she now urges her audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without carceral systems and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. Welcome, panelists, and thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'll introduce our next 3 panelists joining us for this intergenerational conversation. Our first is Ashley Woodard Henderson. Ashley, welcome. Ashley is a 35-year-old Appalachian, a Black Appalachian, working class woman born and raised in Southeast Tennessee. She is the co-executive director of the Highlander Center and Education Center the Highlander Research and Education Center in Newmarket, Tennessee. She has served as president of the Black Affairs Association at East Tennessee State University and the Rho Upsilon chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Inc. She is a longtime activist working around issues of mountaintop removal mining, the environmental racism in Central and Southern Appalachia, and has served on the National Council of the Student Environmental Action Coalition. She is an active participant in the Movement for Black Lives and is on the Governance Council of the Southern Movement Assembly. Welcome. Our next panelist, Philip Agnew, co-founder of the Dream Defenders in 2012. His work in community organizing and art is frequently cited and highlighted nationally. He is a nationally recognized educator, strategist, writer, trainer, speaker, and cultural critic. In 2018, he transitioned from his role as co-director of the Dream Defenders. And in July 2019, he joined the Bernie Sanders campaign as a national surrogate and was later named a senior advisor. Agnew currently is an organizer with Dream Defenders and Black Men Build. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least in any measure is Edna Elizabeth Chavez. Edna is a social justice activist, supporter of immigrant rights, and a survivor of gun violence, who in 2018 headlined and delivered a powerful speech at the March for Our Lives rally in Washington, D.C. Born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, Edna is a 20-year-old student at CSULA, majoring in sociology. She is also an alumna of Community Coalition's youth program, South Central Youth Empowered Through Action, a program that focuses on developing the next generation of leaders and empowering Black and Brown youth in South LA to push for policy changes that benefit their community. She plans on continuing to advocate for social change by using her story and experience to bring a light to the injustices faced by her community. Well, I just wanted to, first of all, welcome all of you to this conversation and discussion. And I wanted to emphasize that the reason why we took the time to read all of your bios was because we wanted our audiences, first of all, to have a deeper introduction to who you are. Hopefully they will do more research and learn more about each of you, but also because we wanted to give a context to the perspective that will be joining in this conversation and the power around this conversation. So I'll kick it over to you, Tendiwe, to get rolling in the discussion.
Thank you so much. And again, I'm super, super excited to hear all of your thoughts throughout this panel. So our first question, organizing, strategy, tactics, then and now. What are the biggest differences and similarities that you see? And I think we should start with maybe our elders for this one. So Dr. Davis or Ms. Huerta, whichever one of y'all.
Well, first of all, let me thank Sankofa and the Kennedy Center for organizing this panel, and specifically Harry and Gina Belafonte. Thank you so much for your work. Over years, helped to prepare the ground for what we are experiencing today. I would say that there are many similarities and there are major differences. In the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, the goal was fundamentally what it remains today, how to create ever larger collective formations that can effectively challenge racism and capitalism and imperialism and heteropatriarchy and ableism. Of course, there are some major differences, and I think one might argue that one major difference is the mandate today to understand what you might call the intersectionality of struggle. That it's no longer possible to focus only on one issue and assume that we can move forward. I think that it's probably important to point out that we're talking about a continuum. We're talking about a continuum of struggle, and therefore it would not be accurate to engage in comparisons as if the 1950s and the 60s could be imported to the 21st century. Yeah. And so what I find most exciting is the way in which younger people have taken up the issues that were differently elaborated early on and have begun to effectively argue that there is no way to end racism without at the same time ending heteropatriarchy. We can't challenge racism without recognizing that capitalism is racial capitalism, and therefore we have to have an internationalist perspective. I think that intergenerationality is so important because those of us who are older and who've managed to survive to this point are important containers of history, and we have stories that we can tell. But at the same time, I think it's so important that those of us who are considered elders recognize that we have much to learn from the younger generation because their vision is much keener than ours. They're able to see into the future, which is their future, and they're able to develop in more creative approaches to organizing. And of course, this is the beginning of a very, very long conversation, but I just want to emphasize the continuity, and I want to express my gratitude to Dolores Huerta, who is, if anyone embodies that impulse to change the world, it is Dolores. And when I see her, I remember the impact of the farm worker struggle on my own conception of what it means to do anti-racist organizing. I remember that I did not eat grapes for I don't know how long. And my niece who was born in that period had no idea what grapes tasted like for many years.
That is so true. I remember that so well myself as a young person. That particular boycott and the impact and how powerful that was, and what a genius strategy to choose that crop that we all so love, and and it's so amazing. Dolores, do you have anything to add in terms of your observations of the continuum of organizing then and now? And Dolores may be frozen. Well, let's move on to some of our young folks. I hope there is not a stigma around me saying young folks, because for so long I was, well, of course I was a young folk, but then I was a tween, and now I'm finally, I think, into elderdom. And so I do refer to you guys often as young folks, in no way derogatorily, but just obviously stating that you in fact are younger. So are there any observations based upon what Angela shared that you might want to spark off some more of this conversation?
Dr. Henderson?
I was looking at you, Rev.
I know, that's why I jumped in.
Sure. I mean, I think agreed. I was, and hilariously, to Gina's point, I was talking to Cortland Cox yesterday from the SNCC Legacy Project, and he was like, I know I call y'all youngins, but I'm everybody younger than 65 is a young person to me. So I also recognize that all of it is relative. And as a 35-year-old, I'm grateful to be called a young person. I think that as a scholar of social movements, particularly the Black liberation movement of the 50s and 60s, I think it's incredible to be in this intergenerational conversation. So I want to also echo gratitude to Sankofa and to the Kennedy Center, and to our elders for actually taking the time to even be down to do it. I think that the thing that I would add is that I hear so often, like, why do the generations not work together? But actually, in my experience, both in the movement for Black Lives and at the Highlander Center and the Southern Freedom Movement, our movements have always been intergenerational. If you talk about the Black liberation movement of the 50s and 60s, you got to talk about the fact that it was intergenerational. The elevator, right. and Fannie Lou Hamer was not in her 20s, right? Like all of these movements have been so often intergenerational. They've always been in principled struggle, and we're not working together because of our ages. But it's true that sometimes we have political disagreement, and guess what? That's also okay. It sharpens our strategies. It sharpens the tactics that we intervene with. But I would just say that I think that part of the reason that the largest social movement in U.S. history is so large is because of the work that our elders and ancestors did before us. It didn't become overnight this summer the largest social movement. It is literally the building of generations and generations of Black liberation struggle. We're not the first, last, or only to do this work. And I think that, like, the period on the sentence for me is that the thing that I think we are unabashedly doing that feels in some ways also not unique because we were taught by our elders is, like, we do have an anti-capitalist framework. We don't believe Black people can be free under capitalism. We do see it as racialized. We do see it as impactful to the gender hierarchy in this country. And I don't know that we would have gotten there so quickly had it not been for our elders saying, listen, y'all have to choose us. You have to choose. You have to choose. Are you just going to do reform, or are you going to be abolitionists? And I think that we got there quicker because we were learning from people like Angela Davis, because we were learning from people like Barbara Ransby, because we were learning from people like Bill Fletcher, who pushed us to be sharp. And so I I don't think that it's by any goodwill of our own, just innately, even though I think we're really incredible people. I think it's because of our intergenerational power that we're actually seeing the gains that we're seeing in 2020.
Yeah. Phil or Edna, do you want to add to that?
I just agree. You've already heard the genius put on display. I fully agree. I would say maybe some of the differences, and I think as Dr. Davis is saying, a scientific approach requires that we acknowledge that these are two different times, two different material conditions. We are in late stage monopoly racist capitalism, right? And so there are some differences between our times, but a difference that I'll draw out, and I agree absolutely, that has not been my experience being in the movement for probably the majority of my adult life. Elders have always reached out, and I've gleefully sat at their feet, right? And so I also push back on the notion that we don't like to listen. I love to listen. I prefer to listen. I'm blessed with, because I grew up in church, an ability or a comfort to speak, but I love listening. But I think what we have lost and what we are beginning to gain back is that emphasis on organization. And so much during this period, there is this love and this joy of being seen and of being the individual and tiny little individual revolutions. And we've seen that that's not a sustainable model for us to move the type of movements that we need. You require organization. And the reason I draw that out isn't just because of the movement. I had an elder, actually. I don't know if they call themselves an elder. They're like 45, but this
Yelder,
right, Yelder. But this brother was saying, you know what? Y'all aren't a part of. When we were younger, we were a part of skate clubs and block clubs, and we were a part of things. And I think one of the opposition's main tools against us over the last few years is to destroy our infrastructure, destroy our organizations, and then destroy the will to join an organization, saying that, organizations just absorb and destroy your individuality, right? And so I think that is something that I'm seeing come back, that I'm excited about, that we entered a little bit of a period where people were not interested in organization, especially when it came to do with activism. But now organizing is returning as an important vehicle and an important practice and praxis for all this theory that we talk about. So I'm excited about this time, and I just want to once again big up the point that Dr. Henderson and Dr. Davis put out, that the connection between our elders in Florida, SNCC veterans, Charlie Cobb, Dr. Gwendolyn Zara Simmons, right here in Florida, the SNCC Legacy Project. Dr. Davis is on the board for the Dream Defenders, in different iterations. Brother Emory Douglas and other Black Panthers have offered guidance to us in the arts field and the arts realm and propaganda. So we've got it. We have the opportunities for these conversations, and I'm enormously grateful. I'd be lost. I wouldn't even be here without them.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I just want to make note to those who are watching. This is Arts Across America. 2 of our elders were having technical difficulties. I'm hopeful that they will rejoin us. And I also know that my co-moderator also, her computer was
Intergenerational,
absolutely. Dolores and James and Pendiwe are having some technical difficulties. But in the meantime, and I want to bring you into this conversation. You were brought into organizing in an interesting way, and you were sort of thrust onto the public space and the public stage, quite abruptly in a way. And I would love you to talk a little bit about that experience and how that then, with your work with Community Coalition, helped you then become sort of the powerhouse and organizer that you are now.
All right, so hi everyone. So I started organizing when I was about 15, and the reason how it started was more so of me, kind of that like, I don't really know what this is about. I'm not sure if I want to stick with it, because it started off as a school club, right? So it was just So then later on being in that space and hearing the kind of conversations that were actually happening, I was just kind of like, wait a minute, like these are actually conversations, like this is an actual issue, like it's not just, you know, a normal thing, like this is actually something that was brought up against us as students of color. And so you know, that's what got me more interested. I was just like, you know, Curious George, where I was like, why, what, when, how. And so after that, you know, I also got more involved more into the elections, and that was a very interesting time for me as well, because I mean, I didn't even know like how important voting was, honestly. You know, through my entire life, it was just kind of like, it was just not even a thing. It just wasn't a conversation that I grew up around. It just wasn't a conversation that, you know, the schools weren't having. It was just, I learned it through organizing. And if it wasn't for that, I feel like I still wouldn't even be knowing where to turn or how important voting would be to this day, or just, you know, stuff like that. I wouldn't know how important the voice would be. And so I feel like it was more, I hit the floor running more when my father was deported after the elections back to Guatemala, that I was just kind of where I said, well, like, wait a minute, pause. Like, this is still happening. Like, this cannot continue to happen anymore. Like, this needs to be stopped. Like, not just because it was me and my father, but because it's just so unfair and so traumatic. You know, I remember how that felt, and I could just imagine, you know, how anybody else has felt. So then when the raids were happening, and, you know, me even seeing ICE vehicles in my neighborhood knocking on like my neighbors' doors, I was just like, this is not okay. So that's where I just got more and more involved. And again, it was the questions. I didn't know that a lot of these conversations were happening or were even a thing. I didn't know that bail was actually a big issue against communities of colors. I didn't know that. Like, for me, it was just kind of like, we don't have the money, we're broke. It is what it is, right? But learning more about it, it was just like, no, this is actually a system that was put against us. So then, you know, progressing and really learning and still educating myself to this day, because there's no limit as to how far you can educate yourself, especially when it comes down to organizing. You know, March for Our Lives came around, and it was just a weird thing. I didn't really know how to go about it because I was around gun violence my entire life. It was just a norm, and it was a norm for a lot of us as well. And so after that, you know, I just didn't know how to go about it. I just felt like I knew I didn't fit in. I knew I just didn't. At least that's what I felt, and that's what I would tell myself. Like, I do not belong here. Like, this is not my space. This is not where I'm supposed to be at. And then it turned out like, wait a minute, yes, I am supposed to be here, because who's going to tell this side of the story, right? And that's how it was for a lot of us on that stage as well, you know, from Chicago, from Baltimore, you know, all students of color that came in and took over that stage. It wasn't just me. It was a lot of us. It was collective of us that showed light that it wasn't just about mass shootings. And yes, those are very hurtful and very traumatic, but let's also acknowledge that everyday violence that is happening around these communities. And let's also talk about how those conversations weren't, you know, being acknowledged by many at such a level that, you know, March for Our Lives was acknowledged at.
Yes, I was very early on asked to assist in helping educate March for Our Lives youth. And one of the first things that I did, which was maybe a week or less after the shooting, was introduce them to Philip and the Dream Defenders, because I felt that it was critical that they immediately had a deeper context on the issues around gun violence that have been plaguing our communities historically for so long. And while they were all now part of that unfortunate club of being not only preyed upon themselves by gun violence, but also having family members murdered, this is something that's been in our communities and traumatizing us for decades and decades. And so that was one of the first things that I did. I want to welcome back Dolores Huerta. Thank you, Dolores, for joining us back again. We've been discussing the ways in which we have discovered organizing similarities and differences from when you may have began your work as an organizer and what you may see now as differences. Angela so eloquently pointed out how it's a continuum and that the times are different. And Ashley and Philip and Edna have now given some perspectives in that conversation. And we would love to hear from you, your thoughts on organizing then and now.
Well, I believe that in today's world, we can see that the organizing can happen pretty spontaneously. I like to say because the tools the young people have, of course, we didn't have back in the day when you got your cell phone and you've got your computers, you've got your Instagram and your Twitter and your Facebook and TikTok. You can just mobilize people so very, very quickly, thank goodness. And I love to see that because, I mean, it fills me, fills my heart with joy when I see all the young people that are out there protesting and marching. I think there's two differences that we have. And yeah, number one, yes, you can educate, you can inform, and people can research, they can look for the truth. You can't hide anything anymore because it's going to come up there on Google somewhere. But I think the one thing is that we can mobilize the people that are of like minds, the people that understand the issues, or at least they're curious about the issue, they're not against the issue. And so the type of organizing that we do is trying to get to those people that are not involved, the ones that they don't understand, they don't realize that they can make a difference. And so the kind of organizing, I think it's still necessary when you get a few people at a time and you make them understand, number one, that they have power, that they can change things, and that they are the only ones that can change things, that they can't wait for somebody to come in and do it for them, that they have to take responsibility to make it happen. And that's empowering them. And sometimes that has to be done in small groups of people to give them the confidence so that they can share their doubts, they can question, and kind of, get all of their fears out of them. And so we see a lot of people that we think we want them to be involved, but they don't know how to be involved. They don't think that they belong here. And I think that's so we have to do both kinds of organizing. I know the type of organizing that we did to build a farm workers union. We had farm workers to make them understand, hey, you can change this. You don't have to take all this abuse. You have the power to change it. And it's very painstaking. Before we had that first strike in Delano, we organized for 3 years with little groups of people, house meetings. And we were actually organized for 5 years, but it kind of got aborted because the Filipino brothers went out on strike. But when we did go out on strike, people came out because they were ready and they knew why they were striking. And I think we have to kind of, because there's still a lot of, as we know, and they say that our country is divided. We just got to say we got a lot of ignorant folk out there, Yeah,
absolutely.
They don't even know that they're being abused, that they're being abused and used by the system. And
right.
And if we can get out there and educate them. Now, I know it's a little bit hard to do, a lot harder to do, especially with poor people, because a lot of them don't have tablets, they don't have computers, so getting, reaching out to them is so much harder because you can't even reach out to them. We can do so much by telephone, and we are doing a lot by telephone, but even by telephone, they're getting so many calls that, it's hard to even get them to listen. So we have all of these challenges and at a time when we need them so critically. And I think a lot of those racists out there, those white supremacists, and I'm not talking about the real super extremists. I guess people can convert some of those. It would take a long time. But then we've got a lot of people out there that don't even understand how racism came to be, how they are part of the racist system, what they have to do to get in and to change it. But, so we have to try to reach out to them too. And I think that's one of the issues that we have as organizers, is that we talk to ourselves, we talk to each other, but we got to reach out to those other people that need to hear our message. And that is the hard part. But we have to do it because I always think of organizers as the missionaries. We are out there to enlighten people, to kind of fill them with knowledge and fill them with energy, fill them with power. That's what we do. It's like if we went around with a magic wand and we touch people and say, you got the power, okay? And you can do something. This is what we do is we are the healers. Because all, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, racism is an illness. And we've got a lot of sick people out there that are waiting for us to come and heal them and to kind of illuminate them. And that, you know, and if we look at our own communities, the Latino community, you know, you got the same thing out there in the African American community. You know, we talk about women's reproductive rights, women's right to abortion, a person's right to marry whomever they want, you know. And we still have those stigmas even in our own, with our own people. And so we got to also address them. And I like to say we got to bring up the conversation. Don't wait for somebody to talk about it. Let's us talk about it.
Mhm.
You know, let's us bring that enlightenment to the people that need to hear it.
That is so
Can I
great
add
what you're saying.
something really quick?
Go ahead, Tendiwe. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. What were you going to say?
No, I was just going to quickly say it's just really so beautiful what you said, Dolores, because it really echoes in a way what Edna was sharing in terms of her feeling out of place and not feeling like she had a nickel in the quarter until she realized that if she doesn't step up herself and tell her story, who's going to tell that story for her and those who share her story? And so, yeah, it's really, really important for us to make space and to find ways in which that we can talk to those who just need deeper clarity and understanding. Tendiwe, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say I really appreciated everything you said, Ms. Huerta, because we're even talking about social media and like the instant gratification. Like we want someone to like right away, or, you know, we expect people to be on the same page as us all the time. And there's less education. There's like less care, I think, essentially. We don't really take the time to make sure, like, okay, do you not understand socialism or communism? Here is a free website or something, or here's a webinar, or you can come to this meeting on this day, because we expect people to just already be there and then just go. Like, we just want to hit the streets, or we just want to, you know, talk about theory or whatever, but we don't actually take the time to care for folks and make sure that, you know, they have what they need. And it's kind of a reflection of the society that we live in. Like, the society does not care about us getting what we need, quality food. We live in food deserts. They leave us on the streets, right? And so as much as we are talking about dismantling those things, we kind of often do it to ourselves. And we need to kind of, well, from my perspective, in the organizing space, kind of sit back and think, what can we do to make sure that we treat each other how the system doesn't treat us, with the love and care and respect that we deserve. So I think that was really beautiful.
Yeah, and I think as healers, and this is going to be hard for people to grasp, okay? As healers, you know, again, if we're like, we can say the doctors of the society, justice doctors, we have to do it with love and kind of curb our anger, because when those people insult us or they don't want to hear our message, but when you are giving that message, it's going into their brain, and they may not ready to grasp or hear the message at that moment, but it's going to stay there. And eventually they're going to hear it. They're going to understand it. So we have to really be super, super patient. And I know we think, can't you see this? And of course they can't, you know, because there's a thing in Spanish, and I think Ms. Chavez will understand, que están tapados, because they like their brains are clogged up, you know, and then they got a lot of garbage in there, you know, so we have to be real patient. And even though they're not getting our message, then we're delivering the message into their brain, and at some point they are going to hear it. I remember when we were on the boycott, and we were working with these little white kids from Alabama, and they were so racist. It was, and we had a young man who had been in the Peace Corps. He was from Birmingham also, and his name was Mitch. And when they would see Mitch coming by, they would start singing "Nigger, get out of my cornfield," and they would start saying all of these, you know, racist crap to him. And it was really interesting that Mitch had so much patience with them. Well, a few years after, we didn't think we could even budge these kids. They were so racist, you know. They were these poor white kids, and And in fact, one of my sons told him, Mom, how come they don't know how to speak English? Because their accents were so thick. And later on, the leader of this group came all the way to Delano to look for us. We were in New York City when this was happening. And he came and he said, I just want to let you know that I understand now what you were trying to tell me. You know, this is like, a couple of years later. It was amazing when he went all the way to find us and tell us, thank you, I understand what you're telling me. So we can keep that in mind. And I know right now, God knows what we're going to be facing, but we just have to remember that we have to be patient. And I don't know if Reverend Lawson got on or not. Well, I was...
Sadly, he hasn't been able to join us.
Well, I just want to say that nonviolence, we really have to preach that. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention, when we did our protests and our marches, the difference then and now is they were very organized, and we had monitors. Yeah, we were attacked, as you know, but we always had monitors in place to make sure that if somebody tried to commit any violence, and we had a lot of infiltrators, that would come in and try to perpetuate violence, but we were able to identify them, kick them off of our marches, make sure somebody got them out of the way so that we wouldn't have what's happening now. And I think, and I hope Reverend Lawson comes on, because of course he is like the master and the teacher of nonviolence. But if we could somehow include that, and I know it's hard because so many of the protests are spontaneous, but even then, if we could have some folks just say, we're going to watch out to make sure none of these, these white supremacists infiltrate our protests. And if we see them acting up, we're going to get them out of the way as soon as we can. So I know it's kind of hard to do when people mobilize spontaneously. And I think that is the one big difference that we had. And we have all seen the pictures of the sit-ins and people getting beat up, and the farm worker movement, people, also our people got killed too. And our people were beaten, not only by people who didn't like us, but also by the police, And so, but we always kept to the whole philosophy of nonviolence. And that is so important, because they will use violence against us, even though it's justified, we might say. And I know it's an easy thing to say, it's a hard thing to do. But if we can all of us perpetuate, and preach the whole theory, let's do the work that we do with love and nonviolence. It sounds corny, but like Caesar used to say, they have more guns than we do. Okay.
Yeah, no doubt.
And we
No
stay
doubt.
alive as much as we can and save as many of our people as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I was listening to a segment with Angela, and actually Angela and Thendiwe were both in it, and I walked away feeling some way about what was said, and I wanted to actually pose the next question based on what I was feeling. And so, born into a country that does not accept our existence, and being overwhelmed by violence, by police violence, by state violence, what does everyday civic engagement look like? What does it look like to us? How do we each day, we're all in it and we're doing the work, and our lives are about civic engagement each day. But for someone who is, I've gotten so many calls from people wanting, to be able to figure out what to do, how to do it with shop owners or lawyers or whatever. So what does everyday civic engagement perhaps look like in this moment that we're in?
Well, can I quote Michael Moore? Michael Moore?
Sure.
I saw Michael Moore on Broadway, and this is so simple. Michael Moore said, in the morning we wake up, we wash our face, we brush our teeth, and then we call our congressman. Now we have to call our senators, because we've got that heroes bill up there in the Senate that they won't vote on, right? And then civic engagement means picking up the phone, calling your senator and say, vote for that heroes bill. Okay, we need that money for people that are unemployed. We got hazard pay for essential workers like farm workers and all of the people that are doing the hard work out there. So that's what civic engagement looks to, getting somebody to register to vote, getting somebody to vote, getting somebody to participate in the census, and supporting us on an issue that we might have in school board. Right now in California, we're working on Proposition 15 to bring in $12 billion into our school system. Let people know about these propositions. Civic engagement just means calling somebody, talking to somebody, getting them to do the right thing, supporting somebody at a school board meeting. So it's easy. It just means, but we got to stay informed and we got to stay involved. because
That's
democracy doesn't work unless we participate. And we got to get rid of the haters out there, and we got to vote them out. It's the only way that we can make it happen. And I like to say to all of the people that protest, all of the things that we want, college, pre-college education, we want universal health care, we want universal child care, we want the Green New Deal. The only way we're going to get that is to elect people into the Congress, into the state legislatures that are going to put it into a law. If it's not a law, it can't be enforced, can't be implemented, and you can't hold people accountable. And that's the one thing I think the young people have to learn, that you got to vote and you got to elect people that are going to make these laws for us. And of course, we want you all to also get elected. And we have to work for public campaign finance reform so that you don't have to be a millionaire to run for office. And nobody's even talking about that right now. We got to get public campaign financing so that the people on this Zoom right now can run for office and get elected.
Beautiful. Please, anyone chime in.
Yeah, I can jump. I think that a couple of things. One, can I be honest, comrades? Like, can I be straightforward?
Let's go ahead. Yeah.
Let's go in. So I think one is like, we also have to prepare our people to govern themselves, right? Like, I think we've seen in 2020 unequivocally the failure of the state to take care of our people. 200,000 people dead at the hands of the state, or even more than their inaction, right? And so what does it look like to, shout out to like the Electoral Justice Project and the Working Families Party and so many folks that have the Black Campaign School and so many folks that have been doing the work to make sure that Black folks are prepared to not only vote for somebody else's campaign, but to run our own, right? I think about the work of the front line where, when it came down to brass tacks, folks were like, you know what, we will defend this election and our people and our communities ourselves. I think about the incredible work that Phil is leading with Black Men Build and what it's going to mean for Black men all over this country to be standing in solidarity with Black peoples across the community that are saying, whether I can vote or not, I would stand here and make sure that you can, right? And I think that there's just some real disdain, I think, where we have made it seem like we're encouraging people to vote for saviors for our community, when actually what I'm voting for is my next target. I'm voting to control the playing field in which Black and brown and indigenous folks and other folks of color and working class people can actually fight for not only our survival, but for our ability to thrive in a place that we have literally built with the blood, sweat, and tears of our communities. And so, I feel excited about what it means in 2020, not only to be voting for a person or a people down a ballot, I'm voting for a platform, right? I'm voting because, like Ms. Huerta said, I'm voting for, the HEROES Act. I'm voting for the Thrive Agenda. I'm voting for the Breathe Act, right? These things that not only are connected to like the street mandates that have come from our movements over the last several years and several decades, right? But was literally written by the people most directly impacted. And I think that's what makes this policy so important, right? We don't get those progressive policies if we don't factor our own folks into some of these seats. And then for the seats that we don't have our own folks running for, I'm not expecting that I'm voting for someone who will be like the person that wipes the slate clean and ushers me into a liberation that they actually didn't help build. That's our work. That's the work of social movements. And so, when I get in conversations with folks my age or younger or older who are like, we've been hearing this same line about how voting is the path to liberation and we don't see it, right? Like I was in Georgia when I watched Brian Kemp steal an election from a woman who earned it, from a base community folks all over the state that had earned it. I get why people in Georgia might be like, you told me my vote counted and then I did it, I trusted you, and then I still didn't get what I wanted. Right. I think we've got to be honest with our people. And so I think that what is exciting about this moment is our ability to trust that people do understand what they want. Right. I do believe that Southerners and country people know what capitalism is and why it's bad, whether they understand what those words are or not. I know that they know what like socialism is and communism is and anarchy is because they taught me, whether they knew the theory and the floating heads or not, right? And so I think this is a moment where we can come together across our ideological differences to actually make sense of this moment for people. I don't think people are confused about the importance of this election. I think what we have is a huge number of people that literally can't vote because of disenfranchisement. We have a whole crew of people that are like, we want to vote. Can you tell me how? Can you tell me where? Can you tell me what I need to do to be a poll worker? Can you tell me what I need to do to defend this election? And I think it's incumbent of us to make sure that we're creating entry points for them to be able to do so.
Thank you, Ashley. Angela, please.
I add, first of all, I want to thank everyone for their contributions. I'm totally in agreement. What I want to say is that I think that we also have to broaden our perspectives and our visions. One of the reasons why this is such a moment of possibility is because people decades ago were talking about issues that appeared to be absolutely impossible to realize. There are many of us who've been talking about abolition for decades, and what we've said is, well, we won't see this during our lifetimes, but this is what we want. So I want to add a dimension to our conversation about civic engagement that perhaps seems far away from where we stand today. We tend to think, when we talk about civic engagement, we tend to think within the terms of the nation state. We tend to think about what's happening here within the U.S. And I want us to think about a more internationalist vision, that our commitments are not simply to this particular country, but they're to a new world. And so we have to be concerned about, what is happening in Palestine. We have to be concerned about the fact that in South Africa, even though the police forces are primarily Black, they are experiencing the same kind of structural racist state violence that we are in Brazil, in France. And so I want us to think more capaciously and to think about the future, but also to think about the world that exists without being restricted by the notion that the nation state is always going to be the way human beings organize themselves.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that's very important because the United States of America, we are such a powerful country, and we are getting, getting in everybody's business in other countries. And I think the one thing that we have to really, we talk about all these politicians, okay? Who is behind them? What corporation is funding them? Because these guys, all of these people are like puppets. They're going to jump to what the pharmaceuticals tell them. They're going to jump to what the banks tell them. So we know who the real enemies are. The enemies of the people are all of these wealthy billionaires and millionaires that don't give a crap about the poor people or the working people. And so what we have to say, like you said earlier, I can't really see your name right because it's so tiny, but what the young woman said about is we got to get our people elected. And in order to do that, we have to do the organizing on the ground that will get them elected, because we don't have the billions of dollars that they've got on the other side. When I think about Dr. King, I think of Malcolm X, I think of John Kennedy, and I think about Robert Kennedy. And we think, well, we know who killed them, but we didn't know who ordered them to be killed. That's the question that we have to ask. Who are the people that are pushing Mitch McConnell's strings? So we got to look behind the politicians and see who is, whose job is pulling their strings. And I think that's really what we have to aim. And like Angela just said, we have to look at it globally. When I speak, and some of you have heard me speak, when I say the word bananas, we got all of these people in cages at the border, all these refugees that are coming from the countries whose bananas we are eating every day, that they never get the money for the bananas that we eat or the coffee that we drink, you know?
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree with Angela. We got to look at this as a global perspective, because these guys, these corporations, they're all over the world, you know, and sometimes we're just focusing on our local school board, you know, which is also very important, because if we want to get rid of racism, we got to, you know, get the people on the school boards that need to promote equity, you know, and be the anti-racist. So anyway, I totally agree with what Angela said.
So I'm going to take the conversation, just for the last moments that we have together here, into a little side direction, which, because this is called Arts Across America, I wanted to talk a little bit from your perspectives, and I know, Phil, you can speak to this quite a bit as well, is what role, in fact, the arts play. And I know you've heard this question before, we all have, and I think it's important to discuss, because especially when it comes to then and now, and because of social media, the arts has broadened a bit into social influencers as well. And so it's not just the actual art in itself, but it's also the power of the platform. And I wanted to just open it up to all of you, and maybe we can start with you, Phil, in terms of you talking about the importance and the power of the role of arts in organizing.
Mm-hmm. So artists are central to any movement for it to be successful. You know, Cuban revolutionaries were quoting Jose Marti. Palestinians still quote the great poets of their canon. American revolutionaries were quoting poetry and great poets. And to me, you know, I always go back to, and you know, I have to do this, you know, your father always recalls the memory of one of our greatest artists, American artists, so who's also an international artist, Paul Robeson, when he said that artists are gatekeepers to truth. And we always conjure Toni Cade Bambara when she says that it's the duty of a writer, and we say the duty of an artist is to make revolution irresistible. And so artists have a central role in being able to convey the vision, the pain, the struggle, the empathy that is required for a movement to grow. For a movement to make manifest, it needs to connect with the art. It needs to connect with the heart. And we see more and more people are not moved by data. They're not moved by numbers. They're not moved by science or facts. More and more people are moved this way by emotion. And it is our artists who have the ability to capture the emotion, to capture the imagination, and to make what we're doing irresistible. And there's a big difference between artists and entertainers. Most of the social influencers we see are entertainers. And what they do is that they use their God-given or their divine given gift for any manner of corporate purpose. And now that the movement has become monetizable, they think that this is an easy way for them to curry the favor of the current milieu of the movement. But artists are people who are brave and courageous and are not afraid to say what needs to be said in the face of losing all manner of money and influence on the other side. And so for me, I look to the motto of your father. I look to Paul Robeson, right? I look to, you know, we look to Jane Fonda. We look to a wide range, right, of artists who are brave and courageous. And I think that's what actually makes an artist and sets a person apart from being just an entertainer. And Black, Indigenous, Brown, Latino artists, I think, have a particular duty. We don't have the luxury to just do art for art's sake.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about what artists and culture bearers have been able to do in the Black liberation struggle from the beginning of time to now, they help us see worlds that we don't feel like exist or could be possible to exist, right? Mm-hmm. When Phil said, I have a rage, I was like, oh my God, I see, like, yes, that's great. That's great. You know, I think about, you know, a week before white supremacists burned down the administrative offices at Highlander, which, you know, so many of you even on this call were so supportive and threw down for us. And I owe you gratitude for that. But the week before March 29th, 2019, we were sitting in the rocking chairs, the historic rocking chairs in the workshop center, talking to some folks from Boston that were on a Southern pilgrimage. And they came down and they were sitting there, and Candy Carawan was sitting in the circle with us. the widow of Guy Carawan and an incredible cultural organizer in her own right. And she started telling a story that I had never heard before about Black folks from the Black Belt South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, coming up to the mountains in Tennessee and being with hillbillies and country white folks from Central Appalachia. And they were talking about how to build this world beyond beyond segregation, which at the time was illegal. What's the total legally thing to be doing? It was illegal for them to be in a space together. And that night, all of a sudden they were surrounded and lights started shining into the windows. So they hit the ground. And at the time, imagine what it is to be like a teenager who's never, a Black teenager at that, who's never been outside of the Gulf South. It's probably their first time in a space with white people. And now you're surrounded by people who could either be law enforcement or white supremacists or both, right? It's terrifying. And all of a sudden this teenage Black girl starts singing, "We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Deep in my heart, I really believe we shall overcome someday." And it was the first time anybody had ever called that verse. And what I know is that she didn't sing that because she wasn't scared, right? But what she was able to do was to call in a courageous, powerful unity that was able to overcome these things, right? So what I know is like the We Shall Overcome Fund and the Roots Collective and the Black Joy Experience are literally ushering in these new worlds that I didn't think I'd see in my lifetime either, Dr. Davis. Like, I really, truly didn't. And I think that that's what shows me the power of cultural organizing as a methodology, right? Like, Highlander actually literally invest in that 24/7, 365, because what we know is that if you take art and culture and faith and spirit, you will absolutely change politics and practices and policies, right? So I just don't believe, I couldn't agree more with Phil, that I just don't think we win. And I don't think we organize the masses to believe we can win without artists and culture bearers.
Definitely. Could I just say that it was at Highlander actually where we met with Mr. B, with Harry and Debbie Glover, and started talking about what was happening in our educational system to Black and Brown children. And by the way, Jane Fonda has a book out now. Please tell all your people about it. And it's called What Can I Do, or What Can You Do, something like that. And she wants us to really let the word out there, put the word out there about her book. And all of the proceeds are going to go to Greenpeace, okay? It just came out last week. So if people can let people know that book is out there, in Jane Fonda's book.
You never has
a movie that just is coming out right now too, okay? So, all right, thank you so much for those beautiful words, Ashley. I see your name, I put my glasses on.
Oh, that's really great. Well, I just want to give it over to anyone who has any thoughts before we end this segment of Arts Across America. Would anyone like to say anything or ask any question of anyone?
I did actually think of a question when you told us that we should have a question for the elders. I feel curious if there are mistakes that you saw social movements in your younger days making that you feel like we're replicating today.
Mistakes that
or failures
in Najda that you think we might be replicating.
I also had a question, and I know we don't have time to answer it, but
let's put out the questions, please.
Well, I'll make my answer really short. I think that we were focusing too much on racial justice and in the farm workers movement, we were focusing on a union, which is economic justice. But I'm talking about the big economic picture. Who's got all the bread? And we need to get part of that bread shared. And I think that's the kind of we're talking about that Angela opened up, but we're talking about this brutal capitalistic system that we live under, and we've got to change it.
Angela?
Okay, well, my question was about leadership and the fact that there's been this tendency to assume that an individual charismatic man has to stand in for movements. And of course, this notion has served to eradicate the contributions of women. And I know that this paradigm has been extensively criticized by young activists. I was interested in what concretely collective leadership means and feminist notions of leadership. So I know the answer will come to me in other ways because we're at the end of this program, but I wanted to put that out there.
Yeah. I feel curious, Phil, if you want to start, and then I can be the period to your sentence.
Or I feel like maybe Edna.
Yeah.
Because I know your experience with March for Our Lives, I think, is really important in that conversation, actually, in the erasure of women, Black and brown women especially. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Edna.
We have a
Would
little
you
lag.
mind repeating? I'm just having like the audio goes in and out.
We're talking about leadership and what leadership. Oh,
maybe if Edna's having some technical difficulties, maybe
Okay.
why don't you speak to it a bit more, Tendiwe, until she can come in.
Okay, well, I know for me, with the BLM movement and everything that's happening now, it's really interesting, especially to see the way that Black queer women and femmes are erased, essentially, even though this movement is built on the labor of Black women and femmes. And it's really interesting because we have this continuous notion that police brutality is something that only happens to Black cis het men, when in reality, that's a notion that's heavily rooted in patriarchy. And we have been kind of talking about recently the brutalization of Black women and femmes with everything that happened to Oluwatoyin, everything that happened to Breonna Taylor. But it's not enough. And we've seen how it's very surface level activism that is being done to uplift the voices of Black women, even though Black women are uplifting the issues of everyone else. So we kind of have to talk about, when we're talking about leadership, also who is most vulnerable and who is not being heard enough. And so I honestly don't think that we've gotten that far when it comes to leadership now. I mean, I try to study as much as I can Black leadership from the past movements. And I've noticed that it was still heavily rooted in patriarchy, but even now people will try and say that we've made tremendous strides, but I think that that's all very surface level. And I think that if we're gonna truly make sure that our leadership is community centered and it is truly uplifting those who are least seen, least heard, most vulnerable, that has to come with dismantling this whole notion that leadership has to be run by men. The messaging of what we're fighting for has to decentralize men. It has to decentralize heteronormativity and all of these things. And so I think we have a long way to go on that front, but feel free, anybody. I don't know.
I certainly, from my own personal experience, being the executive director of Sankofa.org, which is an organization founded by my father and really based and rooted in sort of the institutionalization of the capacity of him, and to be stepping into leadership as a Black woman and having to carry that mantle. It's been a very interesting space to navigate on many, many levels, because while I often am certainly seen in my own right, much of my inclusion in some cases is based upon my father or based upon the name. And so it's interesting, Angela, when you ask about leadership and when we look at how many of the movements that emerge are quasi-decentralized, I'll say. There is a lot of folks who are moving together as a body of leadership, which is what is different certainly from the past. And I would encourage us to continue to really deepen our understanding of what Tendiwe is talking about in terms of the patriarchy and the way in which so many of our systems disregard the power of those who are most marginalized to be in what we will call leadership space. But, as they say, if you don't have a seat at the table, make your own table, and, things like that. And I'm wondering if we ever even need a table anymore. But also, as we were talking about civic engagement, and as we were talking about how it's really about, having a more global view, I really long for the day when our organizing is really about an international scope, because what happens in America really affects so deeply what happens in other countries, and our government policies affect so much what happens in other countries. And so many of us feel like mice on the wheel because we're just trying to focus and try and keep roofs over our heads. And how do we keep our people fed? And how do we keep them out of jail? That it's sometimes overwhelming to think. And I think that we need to sort of demystify that and really know that when we are working in our communities, we are in what was that great saying that Pete Seeger either said or heard from someone else and said louder, which was, think globally and act locally. Because I think all of the things we do, even locally, have an effect on the world at large. All right, well, this has been an absolute fabulous conversation. I see there's only the women left here on the stage, which I think is a perfect metaphor for everything that we're talking about. And I just want to thank you, Angela and Dolores and Edna and Ashley, so much for joining Tendiwe and I for this conversation on Arts Across America. Thank you to Phil for holding up the patriarchy or dismantling it by showing how dismantling it by showing how we can all work in this together. And I also I just want to send some love and prayers out to Reverend Lawson. I hope that it was only technical difficulties. I was looking forward to so much including the conversation around nonviolent direct action, because I know many of us have beliefs and feelings around the application of it and how it works. And I think it's such an important conversation. So I'm hopeful that we can regroup at a later date and have that conversation. I think it is critical. And it's also critical to the differences in the way in which we are organizing each other and the strategies and tactics. But anyway, again, I just want to thank you all so much, so very much from the bottom of my heart. And I truly, truly love and appreciate all of you for answering my call.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
Dina, thank you.
And please, anyone else who's out there, if you can still hear me, vote. Make sure you go to the polls this November and vote. It is important. Get your absentee ballots in now. However you are, if you are going to the polls, put a strategy together so that you can get there safely and that you can have your voice heard and counted. Peace and blessings.
Thank you.